My parents begged me to hide my uniform at my brother's wedding, calling my military service a total embarrassment. But when I walked in wearing my dress blues with a silver star pinned to my chest, 273 high society guests went dead silent, and 13 decorated veterans stood up to salute. My name is Cassidy. I am 34 years old, and my family thought they could bury my achievements to protect their fragile image. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your true worth. The betrayal started exactly 48 hours before the ceremony inside a chaotic VIP bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel. The room smelled of expensive champagne hairspray and raw panic. I was standing near the window looking down at Fifth Avenue when something rough and incredibly cheap hit me squarely in the face. It was a dress. A violently bright Pepto-Bismol pink bridesmaid dress made of synthetic chiffon that felt like plastic. I let it drop to the floor and looked up. My mother Brenda stood there with her hands on her hips, her designer suit perfectly pressed, her expression twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "Put that on, or get out of my sight," she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the room. "You are not ruining your brother's wedding aesthetic with your embarrassing little military costume." I stared at the wrinkled fabric pooling around my combat boots. My dress blues were not a costume. They represented a decade of my life serving as an army combat medic, bleeding in dirt and sand to save lives. But to my parents, my service was nothing but a shameful secret. Tristan, my older brother and the golden child of our family, leaned against the vanity mirror. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than most people make in a month. He took a slow sip of his whiskey and smirked at me. "Listen to Mother Cassidy," he said with a condescending chuckle. "Jasmine comes from a very prestigious family in Washington. Her people expect a certain level of class and sophistication. We cannot have you marching down the aisle looking like a confused security guard. The military is just a dumping ground for college dropouts who could not cut it in the real business world anyway. Try looking like a normal woman for once in your life." I felt my jaw tighten. Jasmine was a brilliant, elegant African-American woman who deserved a beautiful wedding, but my family was treating my service record like a dirty stain on their perfect social tapestry. They had spent months gaslighting me, trying to erase my military rank and my current career as a cybersecurity contractor just to elevate Tristan's fake hedge fund success. My father Richard stepped forward from the corner of the suite. He did not bother to hide his contempt as he pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket. He quickly scribbled a number, ripped the paper out, and slapped it onto the glass vanity right next to Tristan's drink. "There is $5,000, he said, coldly refusing to even make eye contact with me. "Take the money, pack your bags, and disappear until the weekend is over. Go take a nice vacation. We will tell Jasmine's family you had a last-minute work emergency. It is better for everyone if you just stay out of the picture." I looked at the check. $5,000 to erase my existence. $5,000 to buy my silence and protect Tristan's fragile ego. They really thought I was still that same terrified girl they used to control with threats and cheap bribes. For a brief moment, the old Cassidy, the scapegoat daughter, who spent her entire life trying to earn their love, wanted to grab her bag and run. But the combat medic who survived the brutal firefights in the Korangal Valley did not run from entitled bullies wearing expensive suits. I took a slow, deep breath and grounded myself. I calmly stepped forward, my heavy boots echoing loudly against the cold marble floor. I picked up the check. My father crossed his arms, expecting me to pocket it and walk away like a dutiful, defeated child. Instead, I slowly slid the paper back across the glass surface until it rested right in front of him. I locked eyes with my brother, watching his smug smile falter just a fraction. "I will be at the wedding," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying an undeniable weight that commanded the room. "And I will be there exactly as I am." The silence in the bridal suite stretched out thick and suffocating. My father stared at the check, utterly bewildered that his usual method of problem-solving had failed to make me disappear. Tristan, however, did not handle defiance well. His entire life had been paved with golden stepping stones, and he was not accustomed to anyone, least of all me, standing in his way. He slammed his whiskey glass onto the vanity, the sharp crack of crystal against glass echoing sharply through the room. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, invading my personal space in a deliberate attempt to physically intimidate me. He loomed over me, his chest puffed out, his jaw clenched tight with manufactured rage. "Do not test me today, Cassidy," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "This is my wedding. If you do not put on that pink dress and sit quietly in the back where nobody can see you, I will personally call hotel security and have you dragged out of this building by your hair. Do you understand me?" I did not flinch. I did not step back. After patching up soldiers under heavy artillery fire, a soft man in a tuxedo trying to look tough was almost comical. I held my ground and looked him dead in the eye, my voice unwavering. "You love calling me a dropout, Tristan," I said, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow. "You love telling your rich friends that I could not handle the pressure of college, that I was just a failure who had to run away to the military because I had no other viable options left." Tristan crossed his arms, maintaining his arrogant glare. "Because it is the absolute truth," he shot back, his tone dripping with venomous superiority. "Is it?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Because I remember the events of 10 years ago very differently. I remember a rainy Tuesday night. I remember you stumbling into the house completely intoxicated, crying like a terrified child because you had just plowed your brand new sports car into a pedestrian and fled the scene. I remember the police reports, the panic, and the undeniable fact that you were facing serious time in state prison for a felony hit and run." My mother gasped, taking a quick, panicked step forward. "Cassidy, stop this right now," she demanded, looking around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked onto my brother. "I did not fail out of college, Tristan." I continued, stepping even closer, so he was forced to hear every word. "I emptied my entire tuition savings account. Every single penny I had worked for and saved since I was 15 years old. I gave it all to our parents so they could quietly pay off the victim's medical bills and secure an out-of-court settlement to keep your precious reputation spotless. That is why I had to leave school. I gave up my future so you would not end up locked in a concrete cell." Tristan's arrogant facade finally cracked. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward our parents for support. But Richard and Brenda both looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the floor pattern. They were entirely complicit in the cover-up, and hearing the ugly truth spoken aloud stripped away their polished high society masks. They had spent a decade gaslighting me, rewriting family history to make Tristan the brilliant success story, and me the tragic disappointment, all to hide the dark reality of his criminal negligence. "You owe me everything," I whispered, my voice cold and absolute. "And I went to the military because it was the only way to build a life far away from the toxic, manipulative lies of this family. I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet without needing Daddy to write a check every time I made a mistake." "Enough," Brenda shrieked, stepping between us, her face flushed red with suppressed panic and fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "We are not discussing ancient history. Today is about Tristan and Jasmine. Jasmine's father is a highly decorated, very important man in Washington. He commands immense respect and wields significant power in circles we need to be part of." She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. "We have a rehearsal dinner tonight," she snarled, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You will attend, but you will sit silently. You are strictly forbidden from speaking to General Washington. If you dare humiliate us in front of him, I swear you will regret it. You will sit there like a good obedient shadow, and you will not say a single word. Understand?" The Manhattan Steakhouse smelled of aged leather and roasted garlic. It was the kind of establishment where menus did not print prices, and the waitstaff moved like ghosts. I stood near the back of our private dining room, wearing a simple black sheath dress, watching my parents perform their desperate social dance. The Washington family had just arrived, bringing an undeniable gravity to the room. Jasmine looked radiant in a tailored ivory pantsuit, her posture impeccable, radiating the quiet confidence of a woman raised in a legacy of excellence. Beside her stood her father, General Washington. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and immaculate in a charcoal suit. He carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded divisions and shaped military history. My mother and father immediately swarmed them. Brenda practically tripped over her own designer heels to pull out a chair for the general, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she complimented the mother of the bride on her pearls. Richard pumped the hand of the general entirely too vigorously, laughing loudly at a joke no one had made. Tristan hovered right behind them, swirling a glass of scotch, playing the part of the billionaire hedge fund titan. He wore a patronizing smirk, casually dropping financial buzzwords into the conversation, desperate to prove he belonged in their elite orbit. I took my assigned seat at the very end of the long mahogany table positioned next to a swinging kitchen door. It was a strategic placement by my mother, designed to keep me out of the camera frames and as far away from the Washington family as physically possible. I did not mind. I sat in silence, drinking sparkling water, scanning the room. My eyes automatically cataloged the exits, the blind spots, and the structural vulnerabilities of the space. It was a reflex I could not turn off, a survival mechanism burned into my brain from my years in active combat zones. As the first course arrived, the conversation at the head of the table grew louder. Tristan was boasting about a phantom real estate deal in Dubai, inflating his non-existent net worth to impress the uncles of Jasmine. The Washington family listened politely, but I caught the subtle tightening of the jaw of the general. He was a man trained to spot deception, and Tristan was trying far too hard. Suddenly, the general shifted his gaze down the length of the table. His sharp, calculating eyes locked directly onto me. The bustling noise of the dining room seemed to fade into the background. He bypassed my parents completely and addressed me with a voice that demanded attention. "And what about you?" Cassidy the general asked, his tone respectful but probing. "Jasmine tells me you live in the city. What line of work are you in?" I opened my mouth to answer, fully prepared to state my title as a federal cybersecurity contractor. I did not even get the first syllable out before my father slammed his hand down on the table, knocking over a silver salt shaker. "Oh, Cassidy is just trying to find her footing right now," Richard interrupted, his voice laced with manufactured pity. He flashed a condescending smile at the general. "She is a struggling medical assistant. Currently between jobs, actually. She has had a tough time keeping steady employment ever since she dropped out of her local community college program. We are hoping the incredible success Tristan has achieved will eventually rub off on her and inspire her to get her life together." Brenda chimed in immediately, reaching across the table to pat the hand of Jasmine. "We are just so blessed to have Tristan carrying the family legacy. We try not to pressure Cassidy too much. The real world is just a bit too overwhelming for her to handle on her own." The blatant lie hung in the heavy air. They were actively erasing my combat tours. They were erasing the blood I spilled saving lives in the Korangal Valley. They were erasing my current position protecting the digital infrastructure of the Pentagon. They reduced my entire existence to a pathetic caricature just to make Tristan look like the sole pillar of strength in our family. I did not yell. I did not throw my drink. I sat perfectly still, keeping my spine completely straight, my hands resting lightly on my lap, in a relaxed but ready position. I kept my breathing slow and measured, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they desperately wanted to see. Instead, I looked straight back at General Washington. I let the silence stretch. I watched his eyes track my rigid posture and tactical awareness. A silent, powerful current of understanding passed between us. He knew exactly everything. The unspoken connection broke the second. A sharp, guttural wheeze shattered the polite murmur of the dining room. It came from the far side of the table. Uncle Marcus, an elderly relative of Jasmine, suddenly dropped his fork. His hands flew to his throat. His eyes bulged wide and terrified, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above. A prime cut of Manhattan steak was lodged completely in his airway. The heavy oak chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He crashed against the edge of the table, pulling the pristine white linen tablecloth down with him. Silverware clattered loudly to the floor. Red wine spilled across the crisp fabric like fresh blood. Panic erupted instantly. The refined atmosphere dissolved into absolute chaos. Guests screamed. Waiters froze in their tracks, dropping silver trays. Jasmine let out a piercing cry, rushing toward her uncle, but the tightly packed chairs blocked her path. This was the exact moment Tristan should have proven his alpha male dominance. He had just spent 45 minutes boasting about his high-stakes decision-making and his ability to crush any obstacle in his path. But when faced with actual visceral life or death pressure, the golden child completely crumbled. Tristan let out a high-pitched gasp. He scrambled backward so fast he tripped over his own expensive leather shoes. He bumped into a waiter and cowered against the mahogany-paneled wall, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. His face drained of all color, pale and sweating. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the choking, dying man thrashing on the floor. He just stood there, paralyzed by pure terror, watching a man suffocate. General Washington instantly pushed his chair back, his military instincts kicking in, but he was seated at the head of the long table, too far away to reach Marcus in time. I was already moving. The second Marcus grabbed his throat, my brain bypassed the steakhouse, the tuxedos, and my parents. The civilian world vanished. I was back in the Korengal Valley. Muscle memory took total control. I did not waste time pushing my chair back or shouting instructions. I vaulted directly over the heavy mahogany table. My boots cleared the expensive centerpieces, landing with a heavy thud on the other side. I shoved past a paralyzed waiter and dropped to my knees behind the struggling elderly man. Marcus was turning a dangerous shade of blue. His lips were purple, his hands clawing weakly at his collar. His airway was completely blocked. He was seconds away from passing out. I hauled him up onto his feet with a surge of adrenaline, ignoring his substantial weight. I wrapped my arms around his waist from behind, finding the exact anatomical position beneath his ribcage. I locked my hands together into a solid fist. I did not use the gentle, polite Heimlich maneuver they teach in corporate first aid seminars. I used brutal, calculated combat-level efficiency. I yanked inward and upward with massive, punishing force. Nothing. Marcus went limp against my chest. Time slowed down. I adjusted my grip, planted my boots firmly into the floorboards for maximum leverage, and delivered a second explosive upward thrust that lifted the elderly man completely off his feet. A large piece of unchewed steak shot out of his mouth and hit the polished floor. Marcus collapsed forward, gasping violently. Air rushed back into his deprived lungs with a loud, ragged, tearing sound. I guided him gently down to the floor, rolling him onto his side into the recovery position. I checked his pulse, cleared his mouth with 2 fingers to ensure no secondary obstructions remained, and monitored his frantic breathing. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face, but his color was returning. The paramedics had not even been dispatched yet, and the crisis was already entirely neutralized. The restaurant was dead silent save for the heavy, relieved panting of the elderly man. I looked up. General Washington was standing over us. He was not looking at his uncle. He was looking directly at me. His eyes traced the tactical precision of my stance and the clinical calmness of my hands. He recognized the fluid trauma response movements of a highly trained combat medic. Deep, undeniable respect settled into his distinguished features. He gave me a slow single nod of absolute approval. Before I could even acknowledge his respect, sharp fingernails dug viciously into the bare skin of my upper arm. My mother had pushed her way through the crowd of stunned guests. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume masking the smell of spilled red wine, and whispered furiously, "Stop trying to steal your brother's spotlight." Before I could even process the warning, Brenda yanked my arm with surprising strength. She did not care who was watching as she pulled me away from the recovering elderly man. Her heels clicked frantically against the polished floorboards as she hauled me through the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen and shoved me down a narrow hallway toward the ladies' restroom. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, the pristine silence of the marbled room was shattered by her vicious slap against the countertop. She turned on me, her mask of high society civility completely melting away, leaving only pure, raw, venomous rage. "You just could not help yourself, could you?" She spat, her voice echoing off the expensive gold leaf mirrors. "You just had to jump over that table like an animal and make a massive spectacle of yourself. Tristan was handling the situation perfectly fine until you decided to play action hero and humiliate him in front of the Washington family." I stared at her, astounded by her sheer delusion. Tristan was cowering against a wall, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "That man was choking to death. He would have died on that floor while your golden boy spilled his scotch." Brenda stepped into my space, her eyes flashing with a toxic fury. "It does not matter," she hissed. "You deliberately undermined him. You are deliberately trying to ruin his wedding weekend because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of his success, his wealth, and his beautiful bride. I am warning you, Cassidy. This stops right now. I am giving you one final chance to obey." She crossed her arms, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "If you dare show up tomorrow wearing that ridiculous military uniform, your father and I will destroy your little business venture." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She was talking about the trust fund. My grandfather had left me $200,000 when he passed away. It was legally mine, meant to be released on my 35th birthday, but my father acted as the primary trustee until then. It was the exact capital I needed to scale my cybersecurity defense firm and secure a massive federal contract. "You cannot touch that money," I stated, locking my jaw. "Grandpa left that specifically for me." Brenda let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your father controls the distribution," she reminded me cruelly. "If you do not put on that pink dress tomorrow and sit in the back row like you were told, Richard will freeze that account. He will tie it up in so much red tape that you will be bankrupt before you ever see a single dime. You will lose your business, your apartment, and everything you have built. Play by our rules tomorrow, or you get absolutely nothing. Do you understand me?" She did not wait for my answer. She smoothed her hair in the mirror and marched out of the restroom, leaving the heavy door to swing shut. I stood alone in the opulent bathroom, the cold reality of her threat settling into my bones. They were actually willing to destroy my entire livelihood just to protect a fragile, fabricated image. I needed air. I pushed through the door and walked past the bustling dining room, heading straight for the hotel lobby. The grand foyer was quiet the late hour, keeping the crowds at bay. I walked up to the small espresso bar in the corner, needing caffeine to steady the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I ordered a simple black coffee. The barista smiled politely and handed me the cup. "That will be $8, please." I reached into my pocket, pulled out my business debit card, and tapped it against the machine. The screen processed for a second before flashing a bright red error message. "Declined." The barista looked apologetic. "Sometimes the machine is finicky," he said. "Try inserting the chip." I pushed the card into the slot. "Declined." A creeping sensation of dread washed over me. I stepped aside, pulling my phone from my jacket pocket. My hands were perfectly steady when I was saving a man from choking, but now my fingers trembled slightly as I opened my banking application. I logged in, bypassing the main checking screen, and navigated straight to the investment portal where my grandfather left his trust fund. The page loaded. I stared at the screen, my breath stopping in my chest. Brenda had warned me that my father would freeze the money tomorrow if I disobeyed. But the account was not frozen. It was not locked behind red tape. The account was completely empty. The balance stared back at me in stark, glowing digits. Exactly $0. I did not sleep that night. The glowing zero on my banking app burned into my retinas long after I locked my phone screen. When the sun finally rose over the city skyline, signaling the morning of the wedding, I forced myself into motion. I had spent the early hours working out in the hotel gym, burning off the toxic adrenaline my family had pumped into my veins. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, slung my heavy canvas gym bag tightly over my aching shoulder, and headed straight up to the 14th floor to quickly shower and put on that degrading pink bridesmaid dress. I walked down the plush carpeted hallway. I stopped in front of room 1412 and tapped my plastic keycard against the electronic lock. The sensor beeped a flat, dull tone and flashed a solid red light. I frowned. I wiped the card on my leggings and tapped it again. Red light. Another tap. Red light. I jiggled the heavy brass handle, but the door was locked tight. A throat cleared behind me. I turned to see a hotel security guard standing awkwardly near the ice machine. His hands were clasped respectfully in front of his uniform belt, but his eyes held a distinct look of pity. "Miss Cassidy?" he asked politely. I nodded, keeping my posture relaxed but alert. "I am sorry to inform you, but your room reservation has been officially canceled by the primary account holder. Your father Richard called the front desk at 6 this morning. He revoked your access privileges and instructed us to lock the door." I stared at the guard, processing the sheer logistical audacity of their move. "My luggage is inside that room," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "My clothes, my toiletries, and the dress I am supposed to wear to the ceremony in 3 hours. They are all in there." The guard shifted his weight, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "I am sorry, miss. The account holder dispatched a private courier service an hour ago. They packed your belongings and transported them directly to the international airport. Your father left instructions that you are no longer welcome on the premises." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text message from Brenda illuminated the screen. "Since you could not promise to behave like a normal part of this family, we have sent your things to the airport. Your flight leaves at noon. Go home, Cassidy. Do not embarrass us today." I read the words twice. They had planned this perfectly. They had drained my grandfather's trust fund to cripple me financially, and now they were physically exiling me from the wedding so I could not expose Tristan to the Washington family. They truly believed they had completely neutralized me. They thought stripping away my money and my clothes would break my spirit and send me running back to my apartment in shame. They thought I was just a helpless little girl throwing a tantrum. I looked up from the glowing screen and offered the nervous security guard a polite smile. "Thank you for letting me know," I said smoothly. "I will not cause any trouble. Have a good morning." I turned on my heel and walked straight back to the elevator. I did not panic. I did not scream or demand to speak to the manager. I let the doors slide shut and rode down to the main lobby. The sprawling atrium was bustling with wealthy guests, enjoying their expensive morning coffees and reading the daily papers. I found a quiet, secluded leather armchair tucked away in the corner behind a large potted palm tree. I sat down and placed my canvas gym bag on my lap. Brenda and Richard had made one massive catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed all my valuables were packed neatly in my monogrammed luggage upstairs. They had no idea that I never traveled anywhere without my encrypted titanium work laptop, and I always kept it secured in my gym bag right next to my boxing wraps. I unzipped the heavy canvas and pulled out the matte black machine. I rested it on my knees and flipped open the screen. The terminal booted up instantly, requiring dual biometric authentication. I scanned my fingerprint and entered my 50-character alphanumeric passphrase. The system unlocked, granting me full access to the federal defense grid tools I use to hunt cyber terrorists. They thought my $200,000 was just gone. They thought a simple bank transfer could hide their theft from a woman who literally built tracking algorithms for the Pentagon. I cracked my knuckles, opened a secure command line, and initiated a backdoor trace directly into my father's offshore holding accounts. I was going to find every single stolen cent. I did not gasp in shock. I did not drop my cell phone. The burning anger that surged through me in the restroom instantly vanished, replaced by the absolute freezing clarity of a combat zone. Brenda and Richard thought they held all the cards because they controlled the social narrative. They forgot that I controlled the digital infrastructure. I closed the useless banking application and placed my hands on the keyboard of my matte black laptop. The hotel lobby around me, with its soft piano music and murmuring wealthy guests, simply ceased to exist. I was back in a windowless bunker deciphering enemy networks. My fingers flew across the keys, initiating a secure shell protocol that bypassed the standard bank firewall entirely. I did not need their customer service portal. I needed the raw, unfiltered data packets flowing directly through their back-end servers. My military training took total control. Emotion is a liability in a cyber warfare environment. You do not feel. You observe, you analyze, and you execute. I ran a localized packet sniffer tapping into the secure financial routing network. Lines of green code began scrolling rapidly down my black terminal screen. I was hunting a specific digital footprint, searching for the exact moment my $200,000 trust fund was altered. As the decryption algorithms ran in the background, my mind automatically cataloged the variables of the situation. I thought back to the dinner the previous night. I remembered Tristan swirling his scotch, his chest puffed out as he bragged loudly to the Washington family about his incredible hedge fund success. He had casually mentioned securing massive capital for international real estate ventures. He had played the part of the self-made billionaire so perfectly that even my parents looked at him with sheer adoration. He was the golden child, the financial prodigy. But the code rolling down my screen was about to tell a completely different story. Code has no loyalty. Code does not care about family legacy or social standing. Code only deals in absolute empirical truth. I isolated the unique identifier associated with my grandfather's trust account. The ledger history populated on my screen. Richard had not frozen the account this morning. The transaction timestamp indicated the account was zeroed out 3 weeks ago. My father had not executed a hold order to punish me for my behavior at the wedding. The money was already gone long before I even stepped foot in Manhattan. The threat Brenda made in the restroom was a complete bluff designed to keep me under their control. I tightened my jaw and typed a new sequence of commands. I needed to see exactly where that capital had been routed. I bypassed a secondary authentication gate, masking my IP address through a series of secure proxies. I was now operating deep inside the financial institution's internal transfer ledger. I tracked the routing numbers following the digital blood trail as it bounced through 2 intermediary holding accounts. It was a sloppy attempt at money laundering. Whoever executed this transfer watched too many spy movies and possessed zero actual understanding of forensic accounting. I isolated the final destination node. My fingers hovered over the enter key. I pressed it. The terminal returned the target account details. The recipient account did not belong to a corporate holding firm. It did not belong to my father. The offshore account was registered under a private shell company completely owned and operated by Tristan. The brilliant hedge fund manager was completely broke. His entire lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars, the tailored suits, the grand wedding to Jasmine Washington were all being funded by the money my grandfather had specifically left to me. Tristan had not achieved any financial success. He was actively bleeding our family dry to maintain his fraudulent billionaire persona. But a trust fund distribution requires the explicit authorization of the primary beneficiary. My father could delay the release of the funds, but he could not legally transfer the entire balance to my brother without my direct consent. I needed the authorization packet. I ran a data extraction script, pulling the attached PDF documents from the bank server logs. The file downloaded to my desktop. I opened it. It was a formal distribution release form requesting the immediate transfer of $200,000 to the shell company owned by Tristan. At the very bottom of the final page, sitting stark and black against the bright white digital document, was my signature. It was an incredibly precise forgery, down to the slight loop I always put on the letter Y. Tristan had not just stolen my future to fund his fake lifestyle. He had committed a massive federal felony to do it. My brother had forged my signature to withdraw every single penny. My steady fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard, tracing the routing numbers deeper into the complex labyrinth of international banking networks. I could not just stop at the offshore shell account. I needed the complete financial anatomy of my brother. I executed a recursive search script targeting the primary corporate entity legally tied to Tristan. It took exactly 40 seconds for the massive bank servers to hemorrhage their secrets directly onto my screen. I pulled the corporate filings, bypassing the superficial quarterly reports he published for his gullible investors, and dug straight into the raw, unedited general ledger. The numbers scrolling past my eyes painted a picture of absolute financial devastation. The brilliant hedge fund manager had not made a single profitable trade in over 2 years. His entire operation was a catastrophic failure built on leverage and lies. I cross-referenced his trading accounts with the global market database. The reality was staggering. Tristan was not just struggling to maintain his profit margins. His hedge fund had been completely bankrupt for 6 solid months. I opened his active liability portfolio, and the scale of his disaster finally became clear. Red warning flags illuminated the terminal interface. He was currently facing over $7 million in outstanding margin calls from 3 different international brokerages. The lenders were actively preparing to liquidate his remaining worthless assets and file criminal complaints for securities fraud. Tristan was drowning in a sea of debt, and the water was rapidly rising above his head. He had spent the last half-year frantically shifting capital between dummy corporations to hide the massive bleeding from his partners and clients. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme, desperately trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. But the margin calls were coming due, and he had absolutely zero liquidity left to cover them. His entire empire was nothing more than a hollow facade constructed from empty promises and fabricated financial statements. I pulled the transaction history for his wedding expenses and cross-matched the dates with the withdrawal from my trust fund. The timeline aligned perfectly. My $200,000 was not taken to invest or to punish me. It was stolen to pay the immediate deposits for this extravagant 6-figure wedding. The designer flowers, the imported champagne, the rented ballroom, and the customized wedding gown were all being paid for with my grandfather's money. Tristan and Richard had conspired to drain my account simply to keep up appearances. They needed this wedding to happen flawlessly because Tristan needed Jasmine. Or more specifically, Tristan needed the Washington family fortune. Jasmine came from old generational wealth. Her father controlled one of the most powerful real estate empires on the East Coast. Tristan was marrying her to secure a permanent financial bailout. He was using my stolen capital to buy himself a seat at the Washington family table where he could quietly siphon their wealth to save himself from federal prison. It was a calculated parasitic survival strategy, and I was the collateral damage. I watched the cursor blink steadily on the black terminal screen as the sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled into my bones. They had sacrificed my future, my business, and my grandfather's legacy just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. I reached into the side pocket of my canvas gym bag and pulled out a military-grade encrypted flash drive. I plugged the heavy metal device into the side port of my laptop. I ran a secure data transfer protocol, downloading the entire financial fraud dossier. Every forged signature, every hidden offshore account, every margin call, and every fake corporate filing flowed directly onto the drive. I pulled the drive from the port and slipped it securely into my jacket pocket. The evidence was secured. Tristan and Richard were completely exposed. But I still had a massive logistical problem. I was sitting in a hotel lobby wearing workout leggings and a sweat-soaked shirt. My luggage containing my bridesmaid dress was currently sitting in a terminal at the international airport. I had absolutely nothing to wear to a high society wedding ceremony that started in less than 3 hours. I closed my laptop and slid it back into the canvas bag. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a highly classified secure line that I had not used since my last overseas deployment. A crisp, automated voice answered immediately, requesting my operative clearance code. I spoke the sequence of numbers into the receiver and waited for the line to connect. A familiar gruff voice answered on the second ring. "I need an immediate tactical favor," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need a dress delivered to the hotel immediately, and I need it to make a very specific, undeniable statement." Colonel Hayes did not ask for my location or my status. He simply breathed heavily into the receiver. "Cassidy?" he said, his voice laced with sleep and gravel. You are supposed to be on terminal leave. You are supposed to be standing in a pink dress at a society wedding playing the good sister. Why are you calling me on a secure line at this hour asking for a tactical favor? Because my family decided to make things complicated, sir. I replied, staring blankly at the marble pillars of the lobby. They stole my assets. They threw my belongings onto an airplane. I have absolutely nothing to wear to this event, but I refuse to be neutralized. I need my formal dress blues. They are hanging in my secure locker at Fort Hamilton. Locker 42, you have the master override code. There was a long silence on the line. I knew what he was calculating. Fort Hamilton was in Brooklyn. I was sitting inside the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. Navigating weekend morning traffic across the bridges was a logistical nightmare. I have exactly 2 hours before the formal reception begins, I added, checking the heavy clock hanging over the concierge desk. If I do not walk through those doors looking like the decorated officer I actually am, they win. They steal my money and they erase my identity. I cannot let that happen. You want me to dispatch military transport to deliver your dress uniform so you can crash your brother's wedding, he asked. I want you to provide logistical support so I can confront a man who just committed wire fraud and forged documents to steal $200,000. I corrected sharply. I have the entire digital dossier in my pocket. He is bankrupting a hedge fund and using stolen funds to marry into the Washington family. I am treating this as a hostile domestic operation. I need my armor. A low chuckle rumbled through the receiver. I miss that icy tone of yours, Cassidy. You always did treat family drama like a tactical strike. Give me your exact coordinates. I will have a team breach the locker and secure the uniform. Do not move from your location. I am in the main lobby of the plaza, I said. But I cannot receive a military package through the front doors. My father has hotel security on high alert. They locked me out of my suite and they are watching for me. I need a covert drop. Understood, he replied. Proceed to the rear loading dock off the service alley. Give my team exactly 45 minutes. Be ready to move. The line clicked dead. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The clock was ticking. 45 minutes. I stood up from the leather armchair and slung the heavy canvas gym bag over my shoulder. I could not risk being spotted by Richard or Brenda. They were likely upstairs drinking mimosas and toasting to their brilliant execution of my exile. They believed I was currently sitting in the back of a taxi crying all the way to the airport. The sheer arrogance of their assumption fueled the steady rhythm of my footsteps. I bypassed the main elevators and headed for the service corridor. I pushed through a set of heavy swinging doors marked for staff only. The pristine marble and gold leaf disappeared instantly, replaced by scuffed concrete floors and harsh fluorescent tube lighting. Hotel staff rushed past me, pushing carts of fresh linens and trays of polished silverware. No one paid any attention to a woman in workout gear carrying a gym bag. I was practically invisible to them. I navigated the labyrinth of service hallways, following the exit signs, toward the rear loading bays. The smell of expensive floral arrangements mixed with the harsh odor of industrial cleaning supplies. I found a stack of empty wooden pallets near the massive steel roll-up doors and sat down to wait. My mind raced through the coming confrontation. Tristan thought his shell companies were impenetrable. Richard thought his control over the trust fund was absolute. Brenda thought her social maneuvering had completely isolated me. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. I checked my phone. 40 minutes had passed. The heavy steel door mechanism whined and clattered as it began to roll upward, letting in the bright morning sunlight and the biting chill of the city air. I stood up, my muscles tense and ready. The loud roaring engine of a massive heavy vehicle echoed in the narrow concrete alleyway. Tires screeched to a sudden halt right at the edge of the loading ramp. An unmarked matte black government SUV pulled up to the rear loading dock of the Plaza Hotel. The heavy rear door of the matte black SUV swung open before the vehicle settled into its stance. A towering man in a dark suit and tactical earpiece stepped out onto the concrete dock. He did not say a single word. He reached into the cavernous back seat and retrieved a vinyl garment bag emblazoned with the United States Army seal. He handed it to me. I took the heavy bag by the reinforced hanger. I stepped past him and climbed directly into the back of the idling vehicle. The operative pulled the door shut behind me, plunging the cabin into the shadows of heavily tinted bulletproof glass. I unzipped the vinyl bag. The scent of dry cleaning fluid and brass polish filled the confined space. I stripped off my damp leggings and sweat-soaked shirt, tossing them onto the leather floorboard. I pulled the white dress shirt from its hanger and slipped it on. The starched fabric felt stiff and familiar against my skin. I fastened the dark blue trousers, pulling the belt tight. The gold braid running down the side of the legs caught the faint ambient light filtering through the privacy windows. I shrugged on the heavy midnight blue service coat. It fit perfectly. The tailored fabric instantly forced my posture to straighten, aligning my spine and squaring my shoulders. It was not just clothing, it was armor. I reached into the small velvet box secured at the bottom of the garment bag. My fingers brushed against the cold, sharp edges of my ribbon rack and metallic badges. I pinned the ribbons to the left breast of my coat, pushing the brass clasps through the thick fabric until they locked securely against my chest. I did not need a mirror to align them. Muscle memory guided my hands with absolute precision. Then I picked up the final piece, the silver star. I held the small enameled medal in my palm. The metal felt dense and impossibly heavy. I traced my thumb over the raised edges of the star. I did not cry. I did not feel a sudden rush of overwhelming sadness. I only felt the physical reality of the metal and the visceral sensory echo of the day I earned it. The suffocating heat of the Korangal Valley. The acrid taste of burning diesel and copper blood coating the back of my throat. The deafening ringing in my ears as the shockwave of the improvised explosive device flipped our armored Humvee into a dry riverbed. I remembered the agonizing strain in my shoulders as I dragged my bleeding spotter out of the crushed passenger door while enemy gunfire chewed up the dirt around our boots. That day cost me my hearing in my left ear and left a jagged piece of shrapnel permanently embedded in my thigh. The metal in my hand was the physical manifestation of surviving absolute hell. Brenda had demanded I hide this. My mother wanted me to shove this sacred piece of metal into a dark closet and squeeze myself into a pastel pink chiffon dress just so she would not have to explain my military service to a room full of arrogant hedge fund managers. She considered my survival an embarrassing blemish on her carefully curated country club aesthetic. I pinned the silver star firmly above my ribbon rack. The metal caught the dim light shining with a cold, undeniable authority. They had tried to erase my identity to protect Tristan and his fabricated empire of wealth. They had stolen my grandfather's money to pay for imported caviar and designer floral arrangements. They were nothing but cowards hiding behind forged signatures and stolen bank accounts. I snapped the velvet box shut. I picked up my encrypted flash drive containing Tristan's entire financial fraud dossier and slipped it securely into the inner breast pocket of my uniform coat. I smoothed the lapels, checking my reflection in the darkened glass of the SUV window. The woman staring back at me was not a discarded daughter or a jealous sister. She was a decorated combat veteran preparing to execute a hostile breach. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. The air felt crisp. The operative standing guard gave me a single sharp nod of respect before climbing into the vehicle and driving away. I walked back through the service corridors, navigating the maze of hallways until I reached the main foyer. My timing was absolutely flawless. The grand double doors of the ceremonial courtyard were wide open. The wedding ceremony had just ended. Hundreds of guests dressed in expensive tuxedos and flowing designer gowns were laughing and drinking champagne as they moved in a massive, glittering wave toward the grand ballroom for the formal reception. It was time. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom and merged seamlessly into the sea of guests. The sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage was visible in every single corner of the enormous room. Massive cascades of imported white orchids tumbled from the vaulted ceiling. Pyramids of crystal champagne flutes caught the brilliant light of 6 massive chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white coats circled the polished dance floor, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and gold leaf truffles. It was a suffocating display of unrestrained excess. My stolen $200,000 was literally hanging from the ceiling and sitting on silver platters. I stayed back in the shadows near the service entrance, silently watching the social dynamics unfold. The Washington family occupied the prime tables situated near the front. They exuded the quiet, understated elegance of generational wealth. They wore simple, tailored garments and spoke in hushed, respectful tones. Jasmine sat at the very center of the head table. She looked beautiful in her custom gown, but a subtle tension tightened the corners of her polite smile. She kept casting nervous glances at the lavish centerpieces and the towering ice sculptures. The Washingtons did not flaunt their money. Tristan's desperate need to impress them with this gaudy theatrical display was clearly having the exact opposite effect. Jasmine looked less like a glowing bride and more like a captive hostage, realizing she had boarded a rapidly sinking ship. At the adjacent table, my parents were aggressively holding court. Richard stood with his chest puffed out, gripping a heavy glass of vintage bourbon. He had deliberately cornered Jasmine's father, Arthur Washington. Arthur controlled a global real estate portfolio worth billions, but he stood politely enduring Richard's loud boasting. Tristan's latest corporate acquisitions are completely restructuring the market, Richard proclaimed loudly, his voice carrying over the string quartet, playing softly in the background. The hedge fund is expanding so rapidly, we had to secure an entire new floor in the financial district. Tristan has a sixth sense for undervalued assets, Arthur. He is going to double the Washington portfolio within 5 years. Brenda was performing her own synchronized routine right next to him. She draped a hand adorned with diamonds over the stiff shoulder of Jasmine's mother. "We are just so absolutely thrilled to merge our legacies," Brenda cooed, adjusting her silk shawl. Tristan has worked tirelessly to build his empire. He inherited his father's brilliant business acumen. It is exhausting managing such massive capital, but Tristan handles the intense pressure flawlessly. We spared absolutely no expense for this magnificent wedding because our boy deserves the very best. He is a true visionary. Arthur Washington offered a tight, strained smile in return. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he silently assessed my father. Men who actually possess massive wealth rarely feel the overwhelming need to shout about it. Arthur was a ruthless predator in the corporate boardroom, and I could see him calculating the obvious inconsistencies in Richard's loud performance. They were standing on a rotting floorboard, and Richard was jumping up and down, demanding everyone look at him. I remained perfectly still in the deep shadows of the doorway. My dark blue uniform blended flawlessly into the dimly lit periphery. The heavy fabric of the coat hugged my shoulders. The silver and brass medals pinned to my chest felt like a ticking countdown timer. Brenda and Richard were blissfully ignorant of the financial guillotine currently standing right behind them. They were utterly convinced their pathetic theft had permanently eliminated me from the equation. They thought their fragile fortress of lies was fully secured. I watched Tristan confidently navigate through the dense crowd. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He flashed his brilliant, practiced smile at the wealthy investors he was desperately trying to court. He shook hands and clapped shoulders enthusiastically, playing the triumphant master of the universe. He possessed no actual capital, no liquid assets, and absolutely no profitable trades. He only possessed the desperate parasitic hope that Arthur Washington would write him a massive check before Monday morning when the crushing margin calls finally hit the wire. Tristan reached the front of the room and stepped onto the raised white platform. He buttoned his jacket and gestured to the string quartet to cease playing. The soft music faded into complete silence. The low hum of wealthy conversations gradually died down as guests turned their undivided attention toward the stage. Tristan picked up a silver microphone. He tapped it twice, sending a sharp electronic thud echoing through the massive ballroom. He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air. He took a deep breath and prepared to deliver his groom's toast. The sharp feedback from the microphone sliced through the ambient noise of the ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of every guest. Tristan stood at the center of the raised dais, radiating an almost blinding level of self-satisfaction. He adjusted his silk lapels and offered a practiced, universally charming smile to the crowd. He looked directly at Jasmine, but his eyes quickly darted to Arthur Washington, ensuring the patriarch was watching him. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate this monumental merger." Tristan began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I use the word merger intentionally because marriage, just like business, is about recognizing exceptional value and acquiring it." Laughter rippled through his side of the room. Richard and Brenda chuckled loudly, raising their glasses in enthusiastic agreement. Arthur Washington did not smile. He simply stared at Tristan with eyes like chips of flint. Tristan paced across the stage, gripping the microphone with practiced ease. He launched into a speech that sounded less like a declaration of love and more like a quarterly earnings report delivered by a sociopath. He spoke about synergies and maximizing personal capital. He equated building a life with Jasmine to dominating emerging markets. He bragged about the relentless grind required to reach the absolute pinnacle of the financial food chain. "We live in a world divided strictly into winners and losers," Tristan declared, leaning into the microphone. "There are those of us who wake up every single day ready to conquer the market, ready to crush the competition and build empires from scratch. And then there are the rest." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch across the room. The tension at the Washington table was becoming palpable. Arthur shifted his weight, his jaw locked tight. Jasmine stared firmly at her hands resting in her lap, her knuckles white. The Washington family was built on a foundation of civic duty, philanthropy, and quiet generational stewardship. They funded libraries and hospitals. They did not equate human beings to disposable assets. Tristan was completely oblivious to the freezing temperature at the head table. He was entirely high on his own fabricated supply. Success demands absolute ruthlessness. He continued, his voice rising with theatrical passion. "You have to be willing to cut the dead weight. You have to eliminate underperforming assets even when it hurts. Because in the real world, nobody hands you a victory. Nobody gives you a free ride." He stepped to the stage edge, locking eyes with his parents. Richard nodded, practically vibrating with pride. Brenda dabbed at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "We all know people who refuse to hustle." Tristan sneered, his tone shifting from boastful to venomous. "We all have those weak links in our lives. People who expect constant handouts because they simply could not cut it in the real world. Family members who demand a piece of the pie but refuse to put in the grueling hours required to actually bake it. They lack the vision. They lack the discipline. They lack the fundamental drive to be anything more than parasites feeding off the success of their betters." The insult was not thinly veiled. It was a direct, heavily weaponized strike aimed squarely at my ghost. He was publicly justifying his theft by framing me as a pathetic failure who deserved to be excised from the family portfolio. He was portraying himself as the hardworking titan of industry who was forced to make tough decisions to protect his wealth. A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Jasmine closed her eyes for a brief second, a look of profound embarrassment crossing her features. Arthur Washington leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Richard and Brenda, who were still beaming with ignorant pride, and then looked back at Tristan. The judgment in Arthur's eyes was absolute. He was a man who understood the difference between true power and desperate insecurity. Tristan mistook the stunned silence for captivated awe. He believed he had the entire room in the palm of his hand. He walked back to the center of the stage and picked up his crystal champagne flute. He held it high, the liquid catching the light of the chandeliers. "So I raise my glass tonight to my beautiful bride," Tristan said, his voice ringing out across the vast, silent ballroom. "To the relentless pursuit of greatness. To dominating every single obstacle in our path. To success and leaving failures in the dust." He raised the glass to drink. The guests obligingly raised their flutes. The clink of crystal echoed through the room. At that exact second, the massive double oak doors of the ballroom were violently pushed open. The heavy oak doors hit the interior walls with a resounding crack that vibrated through the floorboards. Tristan froze with his crystal flute suspended halfway to his mouth. The smug, triumphant expression instantly drained from his face, leaving behind a pale mask of absolute shock. I stood dead center on the threshold, claiming the space with absolute authority. I was not wearing the wrinkled pastel pink chiffon dress my mother had attempted to force upon me. I was wearing my United States Army dress blues. The midnight blue fabric was perfectly tailored and immaculate without a single crease or imperfection. The gold braid down the sides of my trousers gleamed under the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. My black service boots were polished to a mirror shine reflecting the opulent lighting of the room. My posture was solid steel forged by years of discipline and combat. The silver star pinned to my chest caught the brilliant light, projecting a fierce, undeniable glow that cut straight through the shallow glamour of the wedding reception. The string quartet positioned near the stage faltered. The cellist dragged his bow across the strings in a harsh, discordant screech before coming to an abrupt and complete halt. The ensuing silence was deafening. 273 guests turned their heads in unison. The rhythmic clinking of fine crystal glasses stopped entirely. The collective gasp of the high society crowd sucked the oxygen straight out of the massive ballroom. The visual impact of a decorated female combat officer actively invading a black tie gala was absolute and paralyzing. Wealthy investors and socialites stared openly, their manicured hands covering their mouths in shock. They looked at my boots, and then their eyes traveled upward to the array of combat ribbons and the heavy silver medal resting over my heart. They did not see a discarded sister or a family embarrassment. They saw a soldier. I stepped over the threshold and walked deliberately into the ballroom. The heavy, measured click of my boots against the polished marble perimeter echoed like a ticking clock before I reached the plush central carpet. The sea of custom tuxedos and expensive designer gowns physically parted before me. No one dared to block my path. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, moving with the terrifying precision of a predator entering a hunting ground. I observed the Washington family table out of my peripheral vision. Arthur Washington was not staring at me with the polite confusion of the other guests. He had leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes tracking my movement. He was looking directly at the silver star. A man who understood duty and sacrifice recognized the profound weight of that medal. His gaze shifted from my chest up to Tristan on the stage, and the disgust on his face became absolute. Tristan stood entirely paralyzed on the raised platform. The microphone hung limply in his hand, emitting a faint electronic hum. His arrogant toast about crushing failures hung stale and pathetic in the silent air. He looked exactly like what he was, a terrified child playing dress-up in a bespoke tuxedo. He had spent months carefully building a fortress of financial lies and social manipulation, and I was driving a tank right through the front door. At the table beside the Washingtons, my father was experiencing a catastrophic system failure. Richard's face transitioned from a healthy pink to a dangerous mottled purple. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He took half a step forward, his jaw working furiously, but he stopped himself. He realized instantly that he could not publicly scream at or physically manhandle a decorated military officer in front of Arthur Washington. His ultimate target was watching his every move. Richard was effectively neutralized by his own desperate need to maintain appearances. My mother possessed no such tactical restraint. Brenda stood up from her chair, scraping violently against the floor. Her carefully constructed persona of the gracious, affluent society mother vaporized in a single second. The elegant, polite smile she had worn all evening melted away, revealing the ugly, toxic reality underneath. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her manicured hands shook with rage as she realized her meticulous aesthetic control had been completely destroyed. She spotted a catering waiter standing nearby holding a silver tray laden with fresh drinks. Brenda lunged forward and grabbed a full glass of dark red wine. Her knuckles gripped the fragile crystal stem with terrifying force. She ignored the horrified whispers of the guests sitting near her. She intended to ruin my uniform. She turned away from the Washington table, her eyes locked onto my uniform with homicidal intent. She marched straight toward the double doors. I stood ready. Brenda crossed the expanse of the ballroom floor like a guided missile. The heavy crystal goblet in her hand trembled slightly, causing the dark vintage Cabernet to slosh violently against the delicate rim. Drops of the deep crimson liquid splashed onto her own expensive designer gown, but she completely ignored them. Her entire universe had contracted down to a single obsessive goal. She was going to humiliate me. She was going to hurl that dark red stain directly across my pristine midnight blue uniform coat, effectively ruining the aesthetic of my military authority and forcing me to flee the room in utter disgrace. That was her signature tactic. When she could not control a narrative, she simply destroyed the physical evidence contradicting it. I watched her approach with the detached clinical observation of a sniper evaluating a target. I did not shift my weight. I did not widen my stance. I simply locked my knees, aligned my spine, and snapped my hands sharply down to my sides, forming perfect rigid fists along the seams of my trousers. I assumed the position of attention. Years of brutal military conditioning took over, overriding any basic human instinct to cower or defend myself. I had stared down incoming mortar fire in the Korengal Valley. I had dragged bleeding comrades through burning sand while tracer rounds snapped past my helmet. A wealthy suburban socialite armed with a glass of fermented grape juice was not going to make me flinch. The distance between us vanished in seconds. Brenda stopped less than 2 feet away. The sheer heat radiating from her rage was almost palpable. Her chest heaved. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the chandelier light, sending fractured prisms dancing across my face. Up close, I could see the terrifying depth of her delusion. She actually believed she possessed the superior moral high ground. She genuinely thought my presence was an unforgivable assault on her meticulously manufactured reality. "You disrespectful piece of trash," Brenda hissed. Her voice was low and vibrating with absolute malice. It was a vicious whisper designed to cut me down without alerting the wider audience. She intended to dispatch me quietly and efficiently. "You are a complete embarrassment," Brenda continued, her voice shaking as she raised the crystal goblet higher. "You drag yourself in here trying to steal your brother's spotlight because you are nothing but a pathetic, jealous failure. You think this costume means anything to us. You are going to leave this room right now." She pulled her arm back. The dark red liquid tilted dangerously toward the edge of the glass. She was aiming directly for the silver star pinned above my left breast pocket. She wanted to drown my valor in cheap theatrical humiliation. She wanted to erase my identity and reduce me back to the discarded scapegoat she had always needed me to be. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked in a dead thousand-yard stare focused on a point on the wall directly behind her head. My breathing remained slow and perfectly controlled. I refused to grant her the satisfaction of a physical reaction. I refused to raise my hands to block the incoming strike. Doing so would break my bearing. It would signal submission to her chaotic authority. By standing absolutely motionless, I was stripping her of all power. Her rage was crashing against an immovable object. The silence in the grand ballroom had become absolute. The gentle clinking of silverware had ceased entirely. 273 elite guests were holding their collective breath, watching a bizarre and horrifying family dispute unfold in real time. On the main stage, Tristan stood frozen in terror. He gripped the microphone stand like a life raft, his face completely drained of color. He knew the entire merger relied on projecting an image of stable, respectable wealth, and his mother was currently preparing to assault a decorated veteran in front of his billionaire investors. Brenda let out a sharp, guttural breath. Her arm snapped forward. The kinetic energy transferred into the crystal goblet, launching a dark crimson wave of wine toward my chest. I held my ground, bracing for the wet impact. The wine never reached my uniform. A massive hand shot out from the periphery with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Thick, calloused fingers clamped down around Brenda's wrist like an industrial steel vise. The sudden brutal halt of momentum caused the wine to slosh violently backward, spilling heavily over Brenda's own arm and splattering down the front of her pristine gown. Brenda gasped in shock, whirling around to face the person who dared to physically restrain her. It was General Arthur Washington. He stood towering over her, projecting absolute authority and commanding immediate, unyielding respect from everyone present. The grip of General Arthur Washington was immovable. Brenda gasped, letting out a sharp sound as the bones in her wrist ground together under the intense pressure of his hand. She instinctively tried to yank her arm away, but the older man did not yield a fraction of an inch. His expression remained entirely neutral, giving absolutely nothing away. With smooth, terrifying efficiency, he reached out with his free hand and effortlessly pried the crystal goblet from her trembling fingers. He did not spill a single drop of wine. A terrified catering waiter happened to be frozen in place right next to them, staring wide-eyed at the unfolding disaster. General Washington simply extended his arm and placed the full glass squarely onto the center of the waiter's silver tray. He released Brenda. She stumbled backward, rubbing her wrist, her face flushed with immense physical pain and profound public humiliation. She opened her mouth, preparing to unleash a frantic barrage of excuses and fabricated justifications. She wanted to explain away her violent outburst by painting me as a deranged intruder seeking to maliciously ruin her son's perfect night. Arthur Washington never gave her the chance to speak a single syllable. He completely ignored her. He turned his head and dismissed her entire existence with terrifying finality. Brenda instantly evaporated into a meaningless shadow in his presence. The powerful patriarch shifted his focus squarely onto me. He stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us. The ambient noise of the ballroom had vanished entirely. The clinking silverware, the hushed whispers, the rustle of expensive silk gowns had all been sucked into a heavy vacuum of absolute silence. Hundreds of wealthy guests held their breath, watching the most powerful man in the room confront the uniformed soldier who had just crashed his daughter's wedding reception. He did not look at my face. His sharp eyes locked dead center on my chest. I remained perfectly still, maintaining my rigid stance of strict military attention. I let him look. I let him read the undeniable physical evidence of my service. He was a man who truly understood the intricate language of military ribbons and brass badges. To the corporate elites filling the room, my uniform was just a dark blue costume. To General Arthur Washington, it was a detailed map of combat trauma and survival. His eyes tracked slowly, deliberately across the colorful rows of my ribbon rack. He recognized the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, with its 2 bronze service stars, indicating multiple deployments into hostile territory. He recognized the Joint Service Commendation Medal. He saw the purple ribbon edged in white, validating the jagged shrapnel currently embedded deep in my left thigh. He knew exactly what that small piece of fabric represented. It meant foreign soil had been watered with my own blood. His gaze moved higher, leaving the colorful ribbons behind. He focused on the polished silver badge resting proudly on the dark wool fabric, the Combat Medic badge, an oak wreath framing a stretcher superimposed on a cross. He understood the brutal reality required to earn that specific piece of metal. It meant I had been actively engaged in direct ground combat. It meant I had performed complex medical duties while actively returning fire against a hostile enemy force. It meant I had held torn arteries together and dragged screaming soldiers out of active kill zones while bullets tore through the air around my head. The badge proved I had navigated the absolute worst of human suffering and brought my people home alive. A subtle, visible shift occurred in the rigid posture of General Washington. The tight, aggressive set of his shoulders relaxed a tiny fraction. The stern corporate mask he had worn all evening began to slip, revealing the seasoned combat commander underneath. He understood the raw, undeniable truth standing right before him. Tristan had just spent 20 long minutes bragging about corporate acquisitions and ruthlessly destroying weak financial competitors. Tristan had falsely framed his privileged hedge fund gambling as a heroic form of modern warfare. General Washington was now looking at a woman who had fought and bled in actual wars. The visual contrast was utterly devastating. Then the general's eyes shifted slightly higher. They locked onto the single distinct metal star, pinned firmly above everything else. The Silver Star, the third highest combat decoration awarded in the United States military. Awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. It was absolutely no participation trophy. It was undeniable proof of extraordinary heroism under intense hostile fire. Arthur Washington stared at the star. His eyes widened. The shock registering on his weathered face was profound and absolute. General Washington takes a step back. The entire ballroom is dead silent. He draws a deep breath, his chest expanding. Silver Star in the room. The command erupted from General Arthur Washington with the concussive force of artillery fire. It was not a statement. It was a formal military declaration. The sheer volume of his seasoned command voice shattered the fragile quiet of the country club. The words bounced off the crystal chandeliers and slammed into the marble walls. The echo hung in the air, demanding immediate compliance. Instantly, chaos erupted on the bride's side of the room. 13 men and women seated at the Washington family tables moved with violent, synchronized precision. Uncles in sharply tailored custom suits, aunts wrapped in expensive evening gowns, and younger cousins shot upward. Heavy wooden dining chairs scraped violently backward against the polished marble floor, creating a harsh mechanical screech that cut through the lingering echo of the general's voice. They did not hesitate. They did not look around for permission. They reacted to the command with the deeply ingrained muscle memory of active-duty military and seasoned veterans. They recognized the supreme weight of the declaration. They squared their shoulders, aligning their bodies toward me with absolute focus. 13 spines snapped perfectly straight, 13 chins lifted. In perfect fluid unison, 13 right hands rose sharply to their brows in a crisp, deeply respectful salute. The gesture was razor-sharp. It was a collective physical manifestation of profound reverence. They were ignoring the surrounding wealth. They were ignoring the wedding reception. They were ignoring the horrified stares of Tristan's corporate investors. They were acknowledging the blood-soaked reality of the metal star pinned over my heart. They were honoring the staggering sacrifice it represented. They were honoring the fallen. They were honoring the brutal truth that money could never buy. The visual impact was devastating. The pristine ballroom was suddenly transformed into a military parade ground. The Washington family stood like a solid wall of disciplined steel against the shallow glamour of my family's fabricated aesthetic. They claimed the space. They dominated the room. They stripped away all the lies and manipulations Brenda and Richard had spent months carefully constructing. I stood perfectly still, letting the gravity of the moment wash over the crowd. The air crackled with raw electric tension. I looked at the 13 individuals honoring me. I saw the shared understanding in their eyes. I saw the unspoken bond forged in combat zones and forward operating bases. I felt the immense crushing weight of the star on my chest. I felt the memory of the soldiers I had saved and the ghosts of the ones I could not. I channeled all that heavy, agonizing history into my next movement. I brought my right hand up in a flawless, razor-sharp motion. My fingers were extended and joined perfectly straight. My thumb rested firmly alongside my index finger. The tip of my middle finger touched the outer edge of my right eyebrow, exactly where the brim of my cover would rest. I returned their salute with absolute crisp precision. I held the salute, holding the powerful connection between us. We were a tribe bound by blood and duty, standing firm in a room filled with empty promises and hollow ambition. On the raised stage, Tristan was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. The microphone slipped from his slick, sweating fingers and hit the wooden platform with a loud electronic squeal. He stared at the rigid, saluting figures of his future family with wide eyes. His meticulously crafted corporate persona had entirely vaporized, leaving behind a terrified, trembling shell. He realized instantly that his wealthy investors were witnessing his absolute destruction. He realized the powerful family he was trying to marry into was actively pledging their allegiance to the sister he had openly discarded and publicly mocked. At the table directly adjacent to the Washingtons, Richard looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth hung open. His face was drained of color, turning a sickly ash gray. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The wealthy patriarch was entirely paralyzed by the sudden violent shift in power. Beside him, Brenda was frozen in absolute terrified shock. The shattered remnants of her elegant facade lay ruined on the floor. The dark wine stained her expensive gown. Her hands shook violently at her sides. She stared at the coordinated salute, her mind incapable of processing the scene. She had intended to publicly humiliate me and drive me away in utter disgrace. Instead, she had triggered a massive, undeniable display of ultimate respect. She had crowned me with absolute authority right in the middle of her own extravagant kingdom. I held the salute for exactly 3 seconds. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. I snapped my right arm down, returning to attention. The power dynamic had permanently changed. General Arthur Washington closed the remaining space between us with heavy, deliberate steps. His boots struck the marble floor like a ticking metronome, counting down the final seconds of my family's social reign. Richard finally managed to break his paralysis. My father lunged forward from his table, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He opened his mouth and began to sputter a frantic stream of apologies and excuses. He desperately attempted to construct a narrative where my arrival was simply a tragic misunderstanding fueled by my supposed mental instability. General Washington did not even glance in his direction. He merely raised his left hand, keeping his palm flat and facing Richard. It was a silent, universal command to stop speaking immediately. The gesture carried so much inherent authority that Richard actually choked on his own words, snapping his mouth shut with an audible click. The wealthy patriarch was reduced to an obedient, chastised child. The general stopped 2 paces in front of me. He turned his broad shoulders outward, addressing the entire ballroom. His voice boomed like thunder across the silent expanse, commanding the absolute attention of every single guest. Captain Cassidy, you ran into an active kill zone in the Korengal Valley. The words hung in the air, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and cordite. Guests who had previously viewed me as a disruptive nuisance now stared with wide, unblinking eyes. You dragged 6 bleeding Marines out of a crossfire while taking shrapnel to your own vest. You refused medical evacuation until every last one of your patients was secured aboard the transport chopper. You held the line when the line was completely broken. He turned slowly, his commanding gaze sweeping across the front tables until it locked onto Tristan and Richard. The disgust radiating from his face was absolute and pure. One of those boys was my nephew. A collective gasp ripped through the Washington family tables. Aunts and uncles covered their mouths. Cousins stared at me with a sudden, intense reverence. The connection was made. I was not just a soldier anymore. I was the reason a member of their own bloodline had returned home alive. You told me your daughter was a failed medical assistant. General Washington directed the statement right at Richard. His voice dropped to a dangerous, lethal register. He practically spat the words out. You sat in my boardroom, drank my scotch, and told me your daughter was a tragic embarrassment who could not handle the pressure of basic civilian employment. You completely erased her valor to elevate this pathetic spectacle. She is an American hero, and you are a cowardly liar. The elite Washington family instantly aligned behind their patriarch. The 13 veterans who had saluted me now glared at Tristan and his parents with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The wealthy investors standing near the buffet tables began murmuring among themselves, exchanging deeply concerned looks. The social capital my family had spent decades accumulating was vaporizing in real time. The powerful merger Tristan had promised was currently burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. Tristan stood on the stage witnessing the catastrophic collapse of his entire future. The smug arrogance that usually defined his features was completely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. He watched the investors pulling away. He saw the Washington family turning their backs on his parents. He realized his bespoke tuxedo and his rehearsed corporate buzzwords meant absolutely nothing against the staggering weight of a silver star. His perfectly manufactured reality was tearing apart at the seams. He needed to reassert control. He needed to drag the narrative back to his own perceived brilliance before the investors walked out the door. In his desperate, frantic scramble to save the merger, Tristan made a fatal error. He grabbed the microphone off the floor. The speakers emitted a harsh burst of static. He gripped the stand with white knuckles, leaning forward with a manic, desperate smile. He looked directly at General Washington, attempting to dismiss the entire revelation as a trivial distraction. "General, please," Tristan shouted, his voice cracking with artificial confidence. "Let us not get distracted by ancient history. Cassidy did her job, sure, but that has nothing to do with the future of this company. We are here to talk about the merger. We are here to talk about real power and real money. She is just a soldier. We are the ones building empires." The grand ballroom went completely ice cold. The terrified catering staff immediately stopped breathing. The string quartet players slowly lowered their polished wooden instruments. Tristan had just arrogantly told a highly decorated combat commander that his own nephew's life and my bloody sacrifice were merely irrelevant distractions getting in the way of a simple corporate business deal. Tristan's voice blasted through the state-of-the-art sound system with a shrill, piercing edge that made several guests physically wince. He had completely abandoned the smooth, calculated baritone he had practiced for weeks in front of his bathroom mirror. Panic had stripped away his expensive education and his refined corporate etiquette, leaving only a frightened, vicious little boy cornered by reality. "So she shoots guns!" Tristan yelled, his voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceiling. "Big deal," he sneered viciously. He waved his free hand erratically, dismissively, swatting at the air between himself and the Washington family tables. His bespoke tuxedo jacket gaped open, revealing a rapidly spreading sweat stain soaking through his crisp white designer shirt. He was bleeding confidence by the second, and his desperate instinct was to tear me down to his level. If he could invalidate my existence, he could validate his own. "You are all acting like she did something special," Tristan continued, his pitch rising into a frantic shriek. "She joined the army because she had absolutely no other options. She is still a broke, jealous leech who came here tonight to beg for money from my trust fund." He pointed an accusing, trembling finger directly at my face. He turned toward the clustered group of billionaire investors who were currently edging toward the exit doors. "Do not listen to her," Tristan pleaded, his voice dripping with venom and desperation. "She is a failure in the real world. She has zero assets. She has zero influence. She lives in a pathetic studio apartment and resents anyone who actually knows how to generate wealth. She is trying to sabotage this merger because she wants a payout. She wants my money. She has always wanted my money." The silence that followed his manic outburst was heavy and suffocating. It was not the stunned, respectful silence that had followed the general's declaration. It was the toxic, heavy silence of profound, second-hand embarrassment. Tristan had just committed absolute social and professional suicide on a live microphone. He had accused a decorated combat medic of extortion immediately after a 4-star general had publicly identified her as the savior of his own bloodline. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation was staggering. At the Washington table, the 13 military veterans did not break their rigid military bearing. They simply stared at Tristan with eyes as cold and hard as glacial ice. They recognized a coward. They knew that a man who would publicly slander his own sister's military service to salvage a financial transaction was a man completely devoid of honor or integrity. General Washington stood perfectly still, his jaw locked tight, his massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was no longer looking at a potential son-in-law or a future business partner. He was looking at an enemy combatant. At the adjacent table, Richard finally realized the fully catastrophic scale of the disaster. His son was rapidly incinerating the family legacy. Richard slammed his hands down on the table, rattling the fine china, and lurched to his feet. He opened his mouth to shout Tristan down to somehow stop the bleeding, but his throat simply tightened. He had spent his entire life teaching Tristan that money was the ultimate weapon, and empathy was a fatal weakness. He was now watching his own toxic philosophy destroy his son in real time. Brenda remained frozen in her wine-stained gown, her eyes darting frantically between Tristan and the exit, entirely incapable of processing the complete failure of her perfect family aesthetic. I did not shout back at him. I did not defend my honor or my empty bank account. I simply dropped my right hand from my brow, completing the long salute to the Washington family. I turned my body away from the general and faced the main stage. The heavy measured rhythm of my combat boots resumed instantly as I walked slowly and deliberately across the center of the ballroom floor. The sea of wealthy guests parted even wider, pressing themselves against the linen-draped tables to ensure they did not block my path. I kept my eyes locked directly on Tristan. He watched me approach, his chest heaving heavily, his knuckles white around the heavy microphone stand. I did not walk with anger. I walked with the cold, calculated precision of an executioner approaching the block. I bypassed the stage steps entirely and stopped directly in front of the elevated head table where Tristan stood trembling above me. I looked up at him, letting him see the absolute absence of fear in my eyes. I reached my left hand slowly inside the breast of my midnight blue coat, sliding my fingers into the hidden inner pocket. Well, speaking of the real world, brother, I withdrew an encrypted flash drive and a thick stack of printed financial ledgers. I slammed them onto the head table directly in front of Jasmine and General Washington. The heavy thud rattled their champagne flutes. I ripped the microphone from Tristan's hand. He stumbled backward. I brought the microphone to my lips. I do not need your money, Tristan. I did not fail after leaving the military. I founded a cybersecurity defense firm. I built it from the ground up. I am a Tier 1 private contractor for the Pentagon. My personal net worth surpassed your entire fabricated corporate portfolio 3 years ago. But you need money, I said, pointing at the stack of documents near General Washington. Because your highly leveraged hedge fund went entirely bankrupt exactly 6 months ago. You have been running a shell game trying to secure this merger before federal regulators audit your empty accounts. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy investors immediately began whispering furiously among themselves. Richard slumped back into his chair as his son's catastrophic failure became public knowledge. The financial empire they used to justify their cruelty was nothing but smoke. I turned my attention away from my brother and looked directly at Jasmine. The beautiful bride sat frozen in her expensive couture gown, staring at the financial ledgers with wide, horrified eyes. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy groom was disintegrating rapidly. He forged my signature, Jasmine, I stated clearly, ensuring every single guest heard the accusation. He bypassed the bank's security protocols using my deployment status as cover and completely drained my $200,000 trust fund just to pay for this extravagant wedding reception. He bought your flowers, your catering, and your custom dress with blood money meant for my future. Jasmine let out a choked sob, pressing her hands against her mouth. She looked at Tristan, pleading for him to deny it, but his terrified silence was a complete confession. He is not marrying you for love. Jasmine, I continued, stepping away from the microphone stand and walking closer to her seat. He is marrying you to get direct access to your family's money. He needs your father's capital to cover his massive illegal debts and avoid a federal prison sentence. You are not a bride to him. You are a financial bailout strategy disguised in white lace. Jasmine stood up abruptly. Her chair tipped backward and crashed against the polished marble floor. She stared at Tristan with absolute revulsion. The tears streaming down her face were no longer tears of humiliation, but tears of profound, furious betrayal. She looked at her father. General Washington slowly picked up the stack of printed ledgers. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page. The grim, hard line of his mouth confirmed every single allegation I had just broadcasted to the room. General Washington dropped the papers back onto the table. The heavy thud sounded like a judge dropping a gavel. He looked at Tristan with eyes that promised complete destruction. You stole from a decorated combat veteran while she was deployed, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You defrauded my daughter. You attempted to use my family legacy to shield your own criminal incompetence. You are worse than a coward. You are a parasite. Tristan fell to his knees on the stage. His expensive tailored pants tore against the sharp edge of the wooden platform. He reached his hands out toward Jasmine, begging her to listen. He babbled incoherently about market fluctuations and temporary liquidity issues. He promised he could fix everything if she just signed the marriage certificate and released the initial merger funds. Jasmine did not say a single word. She reached up and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace Tristan had given her that morning. She threw it directly at his face. The expensive jewelry struck his cheek, leaving a red welt before clattering onto the floor. She turned her back on him and walked straight toward her father. Brenda finally found her voice. My mother ran toward the stage, her ruined dress dragging behind her. She pushed past the remaining guests and threw her arms around Tristan, attempting to shield him from the glaring, judgmental eyes of their former high society friends. This is a mistake, Brenda shrieked. She is lying. My son is a brilliant businessman. You are all just jealous of his success. Do not let her ruin this perfect day. The sheer delusion of her defense only cemented their absolute ruin. The investors who had previously tolerated Richard and Tristan now treated them like a contagious disease. They walked out of the country club without offering a single word of farewell, leaving the fabricated empire to crumble into dust. I stood watching the devastation. I pulled my hand slowly out of my coat pocket. My fingers were wrapped tightly around a heavy encrypted steel flash drive and a thick, dense stack of tightly folded printed financial ledgers. I lifted them high into the air for every single person in the grand ballroom to see before bringing them down with terrifying force. I slammed the drive and the heavy papers onto the polished surface of the elevated head table. The loud, concussive thud echoed through the silent room, rattling the expensive crystal champagne flutes directly in front of Jasmine and General Washington. Tristan jumped backward violently, as if the papers were an explosive device. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn for his entire life was completely annihilated. I reached out and ripped the microphone straight out of his sweating, trembling hand. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I brought the microphone to my lips and spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I do not need your money, Tristan. The words sliced through the heavy, suffocating tension hovering heavily over the massive room. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing my cowardly brother to retreat even further toward the dangerous edge of the wooden stage. After I left the active-duty military, I did not fail in the civilian sector. I founded a private cybersecurity defense firm. I built it entirely from the ground up, utilizing the exact same tactical discipline I learned in combat. I am currently a Tier 1 private contractor for the United States Pentagon. My company secures national infrastructure. My personal net worth surpassed your entirely fabricated corporate portfolio 3 years ago. I am not standing here to beg for a single dime of your pathetic allowance. I lowered the microphone slightly and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at the stack of documents resting near General Washington's plate. But you do? I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You desperately need money, Tristan. Because your highly leveraged, incredibly reckless hedge fund went completely bankrupt exactly 6 months ago. You have been running a desperate illegal shell game trying to secure this merger before the federal regulators audit your completely empty accounts. A massive collective gasp rippled violently through the ballroom. The wealthy investors who had previously been inching toward the exit doors suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. Richard slumped backward into his chair, clutching his chest as his son's catastrophic failure became undeniable public knowledge. The financial empire they had weaponized to justify their cruelty and arrogance was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze. Tristan fell to his knees on the stage. He desperately reached his hands out toward the investors, babbling incoherently about temporary liquidity issues and minor market fluctuations. He promised them he could fix the entire situation if they just released the initial merger funds. Nobody listened to him. The powerful corporate titans treated him like a contagious disease, backing away in disgust. I ignored his pathetic, frantic groveling. The real victim of his elaborate deception was not the greedy corporate investors or his enabling parents. I turned my attention away from my brother and looked directly at the bride. Jasmine sat frozen in her expensive custom gown, staring at the financial ledgers with wide, horrified eyes. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy groom was disintegrating rapidly before her very eyes. She looked at me silently, begging for the nightmare to stop. I offered her no mercy. He forged my signature, I stated clearly, ensuring every single guest heard the devastating accusation. He completely bypassed the banking security protocols, using my overseas deployment status as a convenient cover. He drained my $200,000 trust fund just to pay for this wedding. Jasmine let out a choked, agonizing sob, pressing her manicured hands tightly against her trembling mouth. General Washington did not speak. He slowly reached forward and pulled the heavy stack of ledgers toward his chest. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page. His jaw locked into a tight, hard line as he digested the undeniable truth of the crimes committed against his own daughter. He bought your expensive flowers, your lavish catering, and your custom couture dress with stolen money meant for my future, I continued relentlessly. He is not marrying you because he loves you. He does not know how to love anyone but himself. He is marrying you to get direct, immediate access to your family's money. He desperately needs your father's capital to cover his massive illegal debts and avoid a federal prison sentence. You are not a bride to him. You are merely a financial bailout strategy disguised in white lace. The trap had fully closed. Sirens began wailing outside the country club. The flashing red and blue lights reflected violently through the grand ballroom windows, painting the horrified faces of the remaining guests in harsh, alternating colors. The heavy brass-handled oak doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They were shoved apart with commanding force. 6 men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers and sharp business suits marched into the venue. The gold shields clipped to their belts caught the ambient light. They were New York financial fraud detectives flanked by 2 federal agents. The remaining high society crowd instantly parted, forming a wide, clear path for the authorities. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast zone. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression, bypassed the terrified catering staff and walked directly toward the elevated head table. Richard finally snapped out of his catatonic shock. He threw himself into the detective's path, plastering on his usual arrogant billionaire facade. He demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion and threatened to call the police commissioner directly. He shouted that this was a private event and a catastrophic misunderstanding, fabricated by a jealous, estranged daughter. The detective did not even break his stride. He simply stepped around my father, treating the supposedly powerful patriarch like an irrelevant piece of furniture. Richard stumbled backward, hitting a chair and collapsing into it. The detective stopped at the base of the stage. He looked down at Tristan, who was still kneeling on the torn wooden platform, staring blankly at the scattered financial ledgers. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my trembling brother. I looked down at him and spoke clearly into the microphone, ensuring every word was permanently etched into the public record of this disastrous night. I did not just download your files to embarrass you at a party, Tristan, I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy. You fundamentally misunderstood the reality of my civilian career. I am a Tier 1 contractor for the Pentagon. I hold active federal security clearances. When I discovered your shell companies and cracked your encrypted accounts, I found undeniable proof of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny committed against a deployed member of the United States military. I paused, letting the severe legal terminology hang heavily over the silent ballroom. Under federal regulations, I am legally obligated to report those specific financial crimes immediately. I did not bring these printed ledgers here to negotiate with you. I routed the completely decrypted data packets directly to the FBI and the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit 4 hours ago. Your bank accounts are already frozen. Your shell companies are already seized. The evidence was verified before I even walked through those double doors tonight. You are completely finished. Tristan let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine. His entire body shook violently as the inescapable gravity of federal prison crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego. The lead detective stepped onto the stage. He grabbed Tristan by the back of his bespoke tuxedo jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. Tristan offered zero resistance. His legs were entirely like jelly, forcing the federal agent to practically hold him upright. He read Tristan his Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice that overpowered the string quartet music. The detective spun Tristan around and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed like a gunshot through the silent, cavernous ballroom. Tristan began to sob openly, his tears mixing with the sweat pouring down his pale face. The sight of her precious golden child in handcuffs finally shattered Brenda's paralysis. She let out a blood-curdling scream that ripped through the room. She scrambled across the floor, tripping over the hem of her expensive wine-stained gown. She did not run to Tristan. She did not run to Richard. She threw herself directly at the feet of General Arthur Washington. She dropped heavily to her knees, landing hard on the polished marble. She ignored the pain entirely. She was completely consumed by the horrifying reality of losing her son. She reached out with shaking, frantic hands and grabbed the perfectly creased fabric of the general's dress uniform trousers. "Arthur, please!" Brenda shrieked, her face twisted in absolute terror and desperation. "You have to stop this. You are a 4-star general. You have political connections in Washington. You know the judges. You know the police commissioner. You can make a few phone calls and make this all go away. He is going to be your son-in-law. Please save my only boy. He just made one foolish mistake. He is completely innocent." General Washington did not flinch or offer any sympathy. He did not step back. He simply looked down at the weeping, trembling woman, clutching the pristine fabric of his dress trousers. The expression on his face was not anger or outrage. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. It was the exact look a seasoned combat veteran reserves for a traitor caught actively sabotaging his own unit. He reached down with large, steady hands and firmly pried her manicured fingers off his uniform. He pushed her hands away with a slow, deliberate motion that finalized her absolute rejection from his world. He did not bother raising his voice. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who commands thousands. "My political connections are forged in blood and service, Brenda," he stated, his deep voice resonating with lethal calm. "They are not tools to be weaponized for covering up the pathetic, illegal financial crimes of a spoiled, entitled brat. Your son is a thief. He attempted to use my daughter as a human shield against federal investigators. If I make a single phone call tonight, it will be to the federal prosecutor overseeing this district. I will personally ensure that your son receives the absolute maximum sentence allowed under the law. You raised a coward, Brenda, and in my family we do not harbor cowards." Brenda collapsed entirely onto the polished marble floor. The fight drained completely out of her body, leaving only a hollow, ruined shell of the arrogant matriarch she had been just an hour ago. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically, as the harsh reality of her new life finally crushed her. Richard remained completely frozen in his chair, a broken man staring blankly into the abyss of his own shattered legacy. The federal detectives tightened their iron grip on Tristan, forcefully yanking him backward. Jasmine Washington stepped forward. She did not cry. She did not scream or throw a tantrum like a scorned reality television star. She moved with the rigid, immaculate grace of a woman raised in a proud lineage of dedicated warriors. She stopped 2 feet away from the trembling, handcuffed groom. Tristan looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen, his expensive silk tie askew. He opened his mouth to beg for her mercy, to frantically offer another pathetic, transparent lie about his undying, absolute love. Jasmine silenced him by raising her left hand. She stared at the massive 6-carat diamond engagement ring glittering brightly under the ballroom chandeliers. The magnificent diamond had been the glorious, shiny centerpiece of their very constant, endless bragging for the entire past year. It was deliberately supposed to symbolize the ultimate powerful merger of 2 respected, wealthy dynasties. Now it just looked like a stolen, shiny, worthless trinket. Jasmine firmly grasped the heavy platinum band with her right fingers and slid it smoothly off her ring finger. She held it suspended perfectly in the air for a brief, terrible moment, letting Tristan truly intimately understand the finality of her punishing actions. Next to her on the elevated head table sat the half-full crystal champagne flute. Jasmine slowly moved her delicate hand directly over the tall glass. She effortlessly opened her fingers. The heavy, beautiful 6-carat diamond ring rapidly fell through the tense air and splashed heavily straight into the expensive vintage champagne. The shiny platinum sank immediately to the very bottom of the bubbling liquid, settling harshly against the thick crystal base with a loud, definitive clink. Jasmine confidently looked Tristan straight in his sobbing, weeping eyes. Her steady voice was ice-cold, brutally slicing directly through the remaining warmth lingering in the room. "My family bleeds for honor and integrity," Tristan, she fiercely declared, projecting her beautiful voice so the remaining silent guests could perfectly witness his ultimate painful judgment. "My beloved grandfather bravely died actively protecting this great country. My respected father proudly dedicated his entire professional life to noble public service. We strictly build our lasting legacies on true sacrifice and absolute truth. We do not marry common thieves." Tristan lowered his heavy head, weeping openly as the stern detectives gave him a single sharp shove, directing his stumbling footsteps toward the large ballroom exit doors. Jasmine did not spare him a second lingering glance. She turned swiftly away from the completely ruined groom and walked gracefully back to her waiting father. General Washington proudly extended his strong right arm. Jasmine smoothly linked her arm securely through his, keeping her head held very high. The entire Washington family, all 130 of them, rose flawlessly together. They turned their backs on the disgraced groom and walked out of the ballroom in a synchronized, silent mass exodus, leaving Tristan totally alone in cold, tight, heavy steel handcuffs. The crushing silence of my minimalist penthouse apartment felt like an absolute triumph compared to the chaotic, pathetic disaster of Saturday night. Exactly 48 hours had passed since the federal authorities dragged my weeping brother out of that opulent ballroom. I stood completely still in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. The city stretched out below me like a grid of infinite possibilities. My security protocols were usually flawless. My building utilized private elevator codes and biometric scanners to guarantee my absolute peace. I valued that peace. I earned that peace. I fought a brutal war to secure that peace. The sharp, sudden buzz of my private secure intercom shattered the pristine quiet of my living room. I did not flinch. I slowly turned away from the breathtaking city view and walked toward the sleek metal console mounted near the reinforced steel front door. The digital screen illuminated brightly, displaying the live camera feed from the ground floor lobby. The lobby concierge looked incredibly nervous, shifting his weight from side to side. He apologized profusely through the speaker system. He explained that two individuals had slipped past the outer perimeter gate by following a delivery truck and were now refusing to leave the reception desk. He asked if he should call the police to remove them. I stared intensely at the high-definition monitor. Richard and Brenda stood directly behind the terrified young concierge. They did not look like the untouchable corporate titans who had ruthlessly ruled our family for decades. They looked small. They looked weak. They looked entirely desperate. I could have easily instructed the concierge to throw them out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. I could have easily called the authorities to arrest them for trespassing on private property. I did not make that call. I wanted to see them. I wanted to see the exact physical manifestation of their absolute ruin. I pressed the communication button and instructed the concierge to grant them immediate access to my private elevator. I wanted to end this toxic cycle once and for all. I stepped back into the center of my vast living room. The polished concrete floors reflected the stark, bright overhead lights. There were no family photographs on these walls. There were no sentimental heirlooms taking up space. This environment was built entirely on my own merit and my own financial independence. I waited silently. The low mechanical hum of the private elevator echoed softly through the quiet apartment. The heavy metal cables pulled the carriage higher and higher toward my sanctuary. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second. I breathed deeply, deliberately, controlling my heart rate. I was not the terrified little girl they used to bully. I was the architect of their current absolute destruction. The polished steel elevator doors slid open with a soft, quiet chime. The visual contrast between my pristine, secure fortress and the two people stepping out of the elevator was incredibly jarring. Brenda and Richard stumbled into my foyer. They looked completely disheveled. They looked entirely defeated. They were completely stripped of their elitist arrogance. My father wore the exact same wrinkled gray suit he had worn 2 days ago. His normally immaculate silver hair was matted and chaotic. He looked like a man who had not slept a single minute since witnessing his precious golden child being hauled away in federal handcuffs. Brenda looked even worse. The heavy theatrical makeup she always wore was completely washed away, revealing the deep, harsh lines of severe aging and absolute stress. Her expensive designer coat hung loosely off her trembling shoulders. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her shaking hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed and horribly swollen. She stared at my luxurious surroundings with a mixture of profound shock and deep, bitter resentment. They had spent my entire life convincing themselves that I was a worthless failure who would never amount to anything. Now they were standing in my massive, gorgeous penthouse, begging for their very survival. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood on the expensive imported rug, staring at the daughter they had casually discarded. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a drink. I did not offer them a single ounce of comfort. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and stared back at them with freezing, calculated precision. The power dynamic had completely fundamentally shifted. They were intruders in my kingdom. I waited for them to break the heavy silence. I wanted to hear exactly how they planned to justify their presence. I wanted to hear the exact tone of their total, unconditional surrender. This was the precise moment I had envisioned for years. My sweet revenge was finally here. My father took a tentative step forward, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the polished concrete. He slowly looked up, taking in the massive soaring ceilings and the uninterrupted panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. His eyes widened as they tracked across the custom-imported Italian furniture, the museum-quality original artwork hanging on the expansive walls, and the state-of-the-art security interface glowing near the private elevator. For my entire life, he had confidently declared that my career was a pathetic, embarrassing hobby. He had repeatedly told all of his wealthy golfing friends that I was struggling to survive in a cramped studio apartment. Now he was standing in the exact center of a multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece that I owned entirely free and clear. The devastating realization visibly washed over his aging face. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of my financial success. I was not just surviving. I had built a massive, untouchable empire that completely dwarfed his own crumbling legacy. Brenda clung to his arm, her eyes darting nervously around the immaculate penthouse. She looked terrified to touch anything, as if she might break a priceless artifact and be handed a bill she could no longer afford. The silence dragged on for another agonizing minute before Richard finally broke. His shoulders slumped forward and he let out a ragged, exhausted breath. "Cassidy," he started, his voice hoarse and trembling. "We need your help. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." I remained completely still, my face an unreadable mask. I simply waited for him to articulate the full extent of his humiliating defeat. "Tristan was denied bail yesterday." Richard continued, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "The federal judge labeled him a severe flight risk. The prosecutors are building an airtight case based entirely on the decrypted financial packets you handed over to the FBI. They are officially charging him with multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and grand larceny. He is facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary." There is absolutely no way to plea bargain out of the mandatory sentencing guidelines. He is going to prison, Cassidy. My only son is going to a federal prison. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I let the harsh reality of his statement hang heavily in the cold air. But that is not the worst part, Richard whispered, his hands shaking violently at his sides. The bank froze all of our primary assets yesterday morning. They are initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings on the family estate. Brenda let out a pathetic, muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. I raised a single eyebrow, feigning mild curiosity. How does Tristan committing wire fraud trigger a foreclosure on your personal property? I asked, my tone completely flat and analytical. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, a tear escaping and rolling down his wrinkled cheek. Because I secretly used the family estate as direct collateral to secure a massive bridge loan for Tristan last year, he confessed, his voice breaking. He told me his hedge fund was experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. He swore he just needed a short-term cash injection to stabilize his investment portfolio. I signed over the deed to the house to back his corporate loans. Now that the federal government has seized all of his shell companies, the bank is calling in the debt. We have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. We have absolutely nothing left, Cassidy. We are completely bankrupt. Brenda suddenly lunged forward, throwing herself onto her knees right in front of me. The arrogant, cruel matriarch, who had spent decades relentlessly mocking my appearance and sabotaging my career, was now groveling on my expensive rug. She reached out with her shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my trousers. I swiftly stepped back, denying her any physical contact. Cassidy, please, Brenda wailed, her face twisted in pure, agonizing desperation. We are blood. Please drop the charges. Give us a loan. We are a family. You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. You can afford to pay off the bridge loan and save our home. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country to keep your brother out of a prison cell. You cannot just stand there and let us lose everything we have ever worked for. You have to save us, Cassidy. You are our only hope. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman kneeling on my floor. I looked at the broken, defeated man standing behind her. For years, I had meticulously planned for this exact encounter. I had anticipated this massive surge of triumphant adrenaline. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just pure closure. The military taught me many things, Brenda, I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. But the most important lesson was this. Never leave a treacherous enemy with a supply line. You came here expecting me to open my vault because we share the same DNA. You came here hoping I would magically forget decades of psychological warfare simply because you are facing the consequences of your own catastrophic greed. Tristan committed federal wire fraud. He gambled with phantom money and lost. You. Richard gambled our family estate to cover his illegal tracks. I did not force you to sign that collateral agreement. I did not force Tristan to steal. You manufactured your own absolute destruction. Brenda let out a loud, agonizing wail. She scrambled forward, grasping at the empty air. We are your family, Cassidy, she screamed, her voice cracking with raw panic. You cannot abandon us to the streets. You cannot let your only brother rot in a federal cell. I stepped further back, putting cold physical distance between us. My family does not view me as a disposable asset, I replied sharply. My family does not humiliate me at every holiday dinner. My family does not try to sabotage my career or mock my military service. You are not my family, Brenda. You are simply two toxic strangers who happen to share my last name. And as of this exact second, I am officially severing all ties. I am not writing you a check. I am not calling the federal prosecutor to beg for Tristan. I am leaving you to face the exact reality you built. Richard finally snapped. He lunged forward, his face turning a deep, violent shade of crimson. You ungrateful little witch, he roared, spittle flying from his trembling lips. After everything we gave you, after we put a roof over your head, you owe us. I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic outburst. You owe the bank, Richard, I corrected him coldly. You owe the federal government millions in restitution. You owe me absolutely nothing, and I owe you exactly the same. I pressed the security button on my wrist fob. The heavy reinforced elevator doors instantly slid open behind them. "The concierge is waiting for you in the lobby," I stated, pointing directly at the open carriage. "If you do not step inside right now, I will have building security physically drag you out, and I will personally press trespassing charges. Get out of my home. Get out of my life." The cool night air was perfectly still outside my high windows, offering a quiet sanctuary away from the chaos. This was exactly what I had worked so hard to achieve. Richard stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, but he recognized the lethal certainty in my eyes. He knew I was not bluffing. He grabbed Brenda by her trembling arm, hauling her to her feet. She sobbed uncontrollably, stumbling backward into the steel elevator car. The doors slid completely shut, sealing them away forever. The heavy mechanical hum of the elevator faded into total silence. I stood alone in the center of my pristine penthouse. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt a massive, suffocating weight finally lift off my shoulders. I walked slowly across the polished concrete floor toward my custom glass desk overlooking the glittering city. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my high-security terminal. The encrypted biometric scanner instantly recognized my fingerprint. My personal wealth, derived entirely from my lucrative Pentagon cybersecurity contracts, was vast and completely untouchable. I opened my primary banking interface. I bypassed the standard transfer protocols and initiated a direct priority wire transfer. I typed in the amount of exactly $200,000. I designated the recipient account for a brand new philanthropic initiative I had been quietly developing for months: the Silver Star Scholarship Fund. It was specifically engineered to provide full tuition and living stipends for Black and minority female military veterans transitioning into elite cybersecurity roles. I wanted to build a ladder for women who had fought the exact same brutal battles I had fought. I wanted to empower warriors who understood the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. I authorized the transfer and watched the confirmation flash across my screen in bright green letters. My legacy was no longer tied to the toxic, crumbling ashes of my biological family. My legacy was secure in the hands of the brilliant, fierce women who would follow in my footsteps. I leaned back in my chair and turned to look out the massive windows. The vibrant, sprawling city lights reflected endlessly against the dark glass. I was completely unburdened. I was absolutely victorious. I was finally free.